In 1980, while David Bowie was recording the Scary Monsters album at Power Station Studios, he wasn't just making music, he was confronting his past and trying to kill all his creatures. This album, following the Berlin trilogy, reflected the artist's deepest identity crisis, because Bowie no longer knew which character was real. His revival of Major Tom as a drug addict in Ashes to Ashes wasn't just nostalgic throwback, it was ruthless reckoning with his own past. During his divorce proceedings with Angie, Bowie had told Tony Visconti, "This is going to be a more commercial record," but in reality, he was unleashing his most personal and darkest scream of his career. If you're hearing this story and want to learn more, please don't forget to subscribe, because Bowie's psychological warfare during the Scary Monsters period reveals one of rock history's most dramatic identity crises. When David Bowie entered New York's Power Station Studios in February 1980, he had only one completed song, "It's No Game." Gary Numan's commercial success felt like watching a parody of his own creativity, and this had pushed Bowie into an existential crisis. Tony Visconti's confession summed up the situation. "This was our 8th studio album, but I was burnt out." This wasn't just fatigue, it was standing on the edge of creative collapse. This burnout directly affected the studio atmosphere. Even longtime collaborators like Carlos Alomar, George Murray, and Dennis Davis could sense the change in Bowie's mood. The artist had become more withdrawn yet controlling, as if every note, every word was part of an effort to reclaim his lost identity. The song Ashes to Ashes became Bowie's most ruthless confrontation with his past. The innocent astronaut Major Tom, created in 1969, had been transformed into a drug addict strung out in space 11 years later. The lyrics "We know Major Tom's a junkie" weren't just referencing his cocaine period, they were describing how all his created personas had alienated him from his real identity. The choice of Pierrot costume wasn't coincidental, it was a nod to his theater training with Lindsay Kemp, but this time as a sad and lonely clown. His mother's appearance at the end of the music video showed that this reckoning extended all the way to his family. But this wasn't just killing a character, it was Bowie admitting that his creations had become more real than himself, and now he had to destroy them to survive. Teenage Wildlife reflected one of Bowie's most complex emotions during this period: discomfort with mentorship and jealousy of his followers' success. Gary Numan, Adamant, and other new romantic artists were directly influenced by Bowie, but now they were overshadowing his commercial success. The song's lyrics, "New Wave Boys, Same Old Thing in Brand New Drag," were both forgiving and harsh criticism. Bowie was both protecting these artists and attacking them. This emotional confusion showed in the song's nearly 10-minute length, as if Bowie couldn't fully purge this topic from his system. Robert Fripp's guitar work on this track perfectly reflected Bowie's internal contradictions. Sometimes angry and aggressive, sometimes melancholic and nostalgic, the guitars musically expressed the artist's mood swings. This work, reminiscent of Fripp's contributions to the Heroes album, showed how Bowie was trying to break his ties with the past while simultaneously clinging to it. While Scary Monsters was being recorded, a 10-year marriage was collapsing. What Bowie told Angie summed up everything. "You have to divorce me so that we can both be free." The references to marriage counseling books in Up the Hill Backwards were the last gasps of desperation. Even while creating music, he couldn't escape the dissolution of his private life. His controlling obsession in the studio stemmed from this too. Every song had to be his personal therapy. This period marked the end of an era for Bowie. Angie had been instrumental in creating Ziggy Stardust and his glam persona. Now, losing her also meant losing a part of his creative identity. The divorce wasn't just personal, it was artistic amputation. Robert Fripp's role on the album went far beyond musical contribution. The former King Crimson leader was like a therapist who understood Bowie's psychological state and provided musical healing. Especially on the album's darkest tracks, Fripp's guitar helped Bowie externalize his internal screams. Fripp's striking guitar solo on the title track Scary Monsters almost summarized the entire album's atmosphere. The distorted, metallic and cold tones were the perfect reflection of Bowie's mental world at the time. Fripp's music transformed conventional songs into urgent and memorable art-pop masterpieces. But Fripp's intervention wasn't just creative, it was destructive too. When Bowie later spoke about Fripp spraying his guitar throughout the album, he seemed to imply losing control. This reflected the general loss of control Bowie was experiencing during this period. The Pierrot costume Bowie wore in Edward Bell's album cover photos wasn't just a visual choice, it was direct expression of the artist's emotional state. Pierrot was traditionally a sad, lonely and emotionally fragile character. The face hidden beneath white makeup was the perfect symbol of identity uncertainty. The shadow Bowie figure taken from Brian Duffy's photograph covered half the album cover, representing his dark side. This visual metaphor symbolized the artist confronting both his light and dark aspects. The smoking shadow figure showed Bowie's tendency toward self-destruction. Bell's direction for him to remove the pointed hat and smudge the makeup was meaningful too. This action meant the breakdown of the perfect mask and the emergence of the fragility underneath. Bowie was no longer hiding behind perfect personas. Fashion was the perfect example of Bowie's double irony. While mocking the fashion world's fascist tendencies, it also questioned his own role in that world, making it a subject of criticism. Even knowing the song would be a dance floor hit summarized his internal contradiction. The new romantic movement's aesthetic felt like a parody of his own creativity. Fashion was the musical revenge of this discomfort. This track also showed Bowie's skill at social commentary. He could criticize a system while being part of it, exposing its hypocrisies while acknowledging his own complicity. This nuanced approach would become a hallmark of his mature work. The two different versions of It's No Game that opened and closed the album symbolized Bowie's dual personality struggle. In the first version, Michi Hirota's Japanese lyrics combined with Bowie's English translation represented the clash of two different cultural identities. This Japanese element felt like a return to Bowie's 1970s Japan obsession, but with a much darker tone. The contrast between Hirota's emotionless, clear pronunciation and Bowie's often screaming vocals was the musical expression of internal contradiction. Bowie stopping Fripp's dissonant guitar loop at the song's end by screaming "Shut up" twice was the symbolic moment of his war against his own creatures. The second version's calmer English presentation implied the purging process was complete. It was as if Bowie had reached some kind of peace after the internal war that lasted throughout the album. Scream Like a Baby was the dark transformation of the 1973 track I Am a Laser. Handling the same theme much more brutally 7 years later showed Bowie's perspective change. While the song told the story of tortured characters, it was actually an allegory of the artist's own identity struggle. The pressure to conform to society's imposed gender roles and its destructive effect on the individual, this was the raw expression of Bowie's internal war with his androgynous identity. This track also revealed Bowie's growing political consciousness. He wasn't just exploring personal identity crisis, but also systemic oppression. The song worked on multiple levels: personal, political, and artistic. What happened at Power Station and Good Earth Studios was psychological warfare, not musical. Bowie's obsession with giving each song a different sonic identity created the pressure to make a Sgt. Pepper's, Chuck Hammer's guitar architecture, created with the Roland GR500 guitar synth. Roy Bittan's powerful piano touches, technological advancement, reflected Bowie's emotional coldness. Dennis Davis's gloomy drums, inspired by Joy Division, blended the period's post-punk darkness with his own mood. This technical perfectionism was also a form of control. In a period when everything else in his life was falling apart, the studio became the one place where Bowie could maintain absolute authority. The Ashes to Ashes music video became the visual manifesto of Bowie's personal reckoning, including new romantic scene figures from Steve Strange to Blitz Kids in the video, was both a tribute and a claim of supremacy. Bowie was both making peace with the generation influenced by him and declaring his leadership. His mother's appearance in the video's beach scene showed how deep this personal journey went. The lyric "My mama said to get things done, you'd better not mess with Major Tom" merged real life with fiction. In close-ups of the Pierrot costume, the fatigue and sadness in Bowie's eyes beneath the makeup revealed his true emotional state. This video was a manifesto not of simplification, but of exposure. Scary Monsters' both commercial success and critical acclaim meant double victory for Bowie. The album reached the top of charts in both the UK and America. Ashes to Ashes reached #1 in Britain, becoming Bowie's first #1 hit since Space Oddity in 1969. But this success brought new pressures alongside satisfaction. The artist seemed to have found the balance between commercial expectations and artistic integrity, but maintaining this balance wouldn't be easy. The album was seen as both the conclusion of Bowie's experimental 1970s period and the beginning of his 1980s mainstream era. Critics evaluated the album as both a summary of Bowie's work to date and a gateway to the future. Rolling Stone's review described the album as work that fused Bowie's period's metal textures with something darker and more intense. The Scary Monsters album had become not just a musical, but also a psychological cleansing operation for Bowie. In the artist's own words, "This was a process of eradicating the feelings within myself that I was uncomfortable with." He was confronting all the characters he had created, from Major Tom to Ziggy Stardust, from Thin White Duke to Aladdin Sane, either killing or transforming them. This process was painful but necessary surgery. Bowie had remained in the shadow of his creatures for years, becoming unable to find his real identity. Scary Monsters was an effort to escape these shadows and find the real David Jones. By the album's end, the artist emerged more simple, more direct, but also stronger. The symbolic climax of this purging process was the "shut up" scream at the end of It's No Game. This moment was the musical expression of Bowie's rebellion against all his creatures and the voices in his own head. Scary Monsters was a turning point in Bowie's career. It closed the experimental and identity-searching period of the 1970s and provided transition to the more commercial and simple period of the 1980s. But this transition wasn't easy. The album contained all the pain and contradictions of this difficult process. Bowie was evolving from an artist who constantly changed characters to a musician at peace with his own identity. This change was not just artistic, but also personal maturation. His divorce from Angie, recovery from cocaine addiction, and establishing a new life in New York were other phases of this transformation. The shadow figure on the album cover represented Bowie's dark side, while also showing his desire to escape from it. The artist had learned to control it rather than live in its shadow. Scary Monsters went down in rock music history as one of the albums that most deeply explored the theme of identity crisis. Bowie's process of killing his creatures served as a guide for later artists, particularly the pioneers of the grunge movement in the late 1980s, drew inspiration from Bowie's approach. The album also had the distinction of being the first major pop work to address the conflict between artistic identity and personal identity. Bowie had laid out the tension between being famous and being oneself, between being creative and being himself. This theme became even more relevant in today's social media age. Musically, the album also represented the perfect synthesis of art rock and pop music. This work, which pioneered the new wave movement, shaped the sound of the 1980s and continues to influence many artists today. The psychological complexity and musical innovation of Scary Monsters proved that pop music could be both commercially successful and artistically ambitious. Bowie had shown that you could be both accessible and challenging, both popular and profound.